not felt they've had an opportunity to speak, I will keep the Zoom meeting open at the very end. So I'm going to begin here with session 1. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm Richard Trudeau. I'm a semi-retired UU minister living in Massachusetts. I am involved with the Unitarian Church in Fall River, Massachusetts. That's my home congregation. And this year I'm the chair of the board of directors of UMIAC. And here's my little speech here. I'm trying to assess what's happened to the UU movement in terms of fighting racial justice over the last 30 years. I think it started with a mental virus. Mental viruses, that's my term. Sometimes they're called social contagions. Sometimes they're called a little bit unkindly mass delusions. I like mental virus. By a mental virus, I mean a bad idea that becomes widespread. For example, lots of us are old enough to remember back in the 1980s when for several years there were pictures of missing children on milk cartons. Remember that? The news was, and this was correct, that there were thousands and thousands of missing and presumably kidnapped children in the United States, and that was true. And it was such a shock that very few people took the trouble to try to verify that or verify the move to put children on milk cartons. The children's faces were put on milk cartons because this was presumably going to have the effect of returning these children to their families, rescuing them from their kidnappers. Well, this was a bad idea, though. It was revealed to be a bad idea when a few people went beyond their feelings, tried to verify their feelings. They investigated and they learned, and eventually this became public knowledge, that virtually all of these thousands of children had been kidnapped, yes, but by one of their parents during a custody battle. And when that became widespread, the pictures disappeared from the milk cartons. That was a mental virus. Some of you may remember another mental virus in the early 90s about recovered memories, when sincere therapists unconsciously were implanting in their clients what were really false memories of sexual abuse at the hands of close relatives. And this was discredited after a while. It took a while. There are still people in prison because of that today. That was another mental virus. Well, in the 1990s, a mental virus emerged, and I believe this is the root of the turmoil in Unitarian Universalism. And the bad idea of this mental virus was, and continues to be, that in the United States, racism has risen to the level of a national crisis. I think that's false. This was proclaimed by people like the Reverend Al Sharpton, who thundered on TV over and over. Imagine his thundering voice. Racism is just as bad as it ever was. It's just gone underground, he said over and over and over. Some were skeptical of Reverend Sharpton in view of the fact that his livelihood, after all, depends on his ability to detect racism. But nonetheless, he attracted many well-intentioned acolytes who did not bother to verify their feelings with reason or evidence. And UU leaders, I mean the national officials in the Ministers Association, I mean at the seminaries, I mean at the UUA, and a great many UU ministers subscribed to this mental, or became victims of this mental virus. You might say, who am I, a white man? not only a white man, an old, straight, cisgendered white man. Who am I, a person of pallor, to opine about racism? Virtually all of my ancestors came from France or the United Kingdom. I certainly don't have the lived experience, as it is called, of being a black person in the United States. But I do have my own lived experience, that of an intelligent, curious, and observant white person who has been paying attention to racism in the United States for 72 years. It was when I was 5, on the first day of first grade, that my mother said to me, "Now there may be Negro children in your class. If there are, other children may call them the N-word. Don't ever say that. It hurts their feelings." I asked, "Why would kids want to hurt their feelings?" She said, "Well, some people think that Negroes aren't as good as other people." I asked, "Is that true?" She said, "Of course not." That was in 1951. I was 5. I remember Brown versus Board of Education. I remember seeing it in the headlines. I was 8 years old. Hearing about it on the news, it took me 2 or 3 days to figure out what it was about, but I was horrified when I learned that what it was about was that in the South, black kids had to go to bad schools. I remember the Montgomery bus boycott and how it went on for more than a year. I remember the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Law. Many years later, I served on my city's Fair Housing Commission. I have read dozens of books, many dozens of books by African Americans about what it's like to be black in the United States, beginning with Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery when I was in elementary school, until recently books by Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and John McWhorter and Eric Smith and Thomas Chatterton Williams and Heather McGhee. A lot of people who call themselves woke call themselves that because they say, "I woke up to the reality of racism in the United States." Well, to those of you who call yourselves woke, I say, I respect that, but in my opinion, when you woke up to the reality of racism in the United States, I was already awake and had been for a long time. In the 1990s, I was confused when UU officials, whom I now say were victims of the mental virus, I was confused when UU officials started speaking of racism as being at the level of a national crisis. This contradicted my own perception that racism had declined continuously, decade by decade, yes, with fits and starts, but it had declined continuously throughout my lifetime. In that same decade, the 90s, congregants at the churches I served were telling me that their teenage children, their high school age children, considered interracial dating to be, quote, "no big deal," end quote. I thought, oh my goodness, how wonderful. To investigate what UU officials were saying, I thought about the black people I knew, and I decided there were 3 that I knew well enough to ask about their experience with racism. They all said that racism was real, and they had occasionally experienced it, and it had been infuriating, but it had only been an inconvenience and not the obstacle it had been for their grandparents. They felt they could live wherever they wanted, date whomever they wanted, go after any job they wanted. What about George Floyd? I can imagine people saying in response to what I've said so far. What about George Floyd? Yes. Well, what about George Floyd? That video of his killing was gut-wrenching, and I watched it more than once. But gut-wrenching though it was, that doesn't prove that racism in the United States has risen to the level of a national crisis. In fact, I don't misunderstand me when I say this. That video was a good thing. Not that George was killed, but that video, which I think is the first widely circulated video of a police killing of an unarmed black person, that video is a good thing because it prevents people from denying that this kind of stuff happens. I think that kind of thing that we saw in the George Floyd video has been happening year after year after year after year for a lot longer than I've been alive. But it's been easy to not take it seriously. And that video prevents us from turning our eyes away. But it certainly does not prove anything about the level of racism in the U.S. Let me tell you an anecdote related to George Floyd for a minute. Uh, George was killed, I think, on May 25th, 2020, on the anniversary of that. So this is May 25th, 2021. I was talking to a fellow UU minister who had drunk deeply of the Kool-Aid of the UU religious or racial justice point of view. And I said to him, how many unarmed black people do you think the police killed in 2020? I mean, yes, there's George Floyd, but how many total? How many others? And I understand you probably don't know the exact number, but what's your feeling about the range? What's your feeling? Did the police kill 10 unarmed black people in 2020? Or more like 100? Or more like 1,000? Or 5,000? And he thought for a minute and he said, well, certainly more than 100. Probably not as many as 1,000. He said, if I had to guess, I'd say something like 700 or 800. The answer is 18, 18, 1-8. According to the Washington Post, which has been keeping careful statistics on this kind of thing for several years now. And by contrast, the number of unarmed white people killed by police in 2020 was 26. And that proves to me, to my mind anyway, that racism is real. I've never doubted that racism is real, but I mean, this is certainly evidence that racism is real because it's not proportionate. There are only about 1/5 as many blacks as whites in the US. And if 26 unarmed white people were killed by the police, then a proportional number for blacks would be 1/5 of 26, or about 5, and not 18, which is the actual number. To my mind, racism certainly explains some of that discrepancy, but there are other considerations that are relevant too, like the fact that young black men commit a lot of crimes, a lot more than young white men, and have many more encounters with police. That's a factor too. My point is, the UU approach to social justice is based on a falsehood, the falsehood that beginning in the 90s and continuing to this very moment, the level of racism in the United States is at the level of a crisis. That's just not the case, in my opinion. And now I'm going to stop the recording and for, let's say, until at the latest half past, entertain challenges or questions or comments.